Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'll give folks just a couple of moments to come into the virtual space. Thank you so much for joining us for today's national webinar presented by SAMHSA's Gain Center with the support of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Our webinar today is One Size Doesn't Fit All, providing tailored support for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system. Our presenters today are Leanne Davis and Robin Holt, and I will introduce them shortly. I'm Dr. Melissa Stein. I go by pronouns she, her. I'm a Senior Research Associate at SAMHSA's Gain Center and Policy Research Associates. You will see a chat box on the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself and share where you're joining us from. Before we start our presentations, I have a few introductory items to review. First, the views, opinion, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Throughout the presentations, if you have questions for the presenters or in regards to the technology, please type them in the Q&A pod. The Q&A icon can be found at the bottom of your screen. At the conclusion of the presentations, we will address as many of the questions as time permits. We'll also be conducting a couple of polls throughout the event and appreciate your participation. When you see a poll pop up, please select and submit your responses. And you should have just seen a poll pop up, and we would really appreciate your participation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will disseminate the slides in a few days following this event. We'll also notify you when the recording is posted to SAMHSA's YouTube channel. A certificate of attendance will be available for download at the end of today's webinar. Please note this certificate is for your personal portfolio use only. We are not able to offer CEU credits. We do have ASL interpretation today. Our interpreters for this meeting are Dwight Godwin and Kip Opperman. We also have live captioning for today's webinar. To view live captioning, click Live Transcript CC, then select Show Subtitles. Just a quick look at our agenda. Coming up next, Roxanne Castaneda will provide some opening remarks on behalf of SAMHSA. She'll be followed by presentations from our speakers. For now, I'd like to turn it over to Roxanne Castaneda, who is a public health advisor at the Center for Mental Health Services at SAMHSA, for her opening remarks. Roxanne.
Thank you very much. Welcome all. I'm the criminal justice lead for DSSI in the Center for Mental Health Services here at SAMHSA and the task lead for the SAMHSA Gains contract. In a previous capacity, I served as a statewide forensic coordinator for people with IDD and criminal justice issues, both in Maryland and in Massachusetts. In both states, the complexity of multiple diagnosis and challenging needs pose a serious dilemma for the individual and the systems that they seek assistance from. In some cases, there is a refusal to accept responsibility for the person with multiple disabilities or diagnosis. A shuffle ensues from one funding agency or administration to another, often leaving the individual without treatment or services, which could include housing, employment, emergency room access, necessary hospitalization, or crisis care. According to the joint position statement between the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and the ARC, which was done in 2014, When individuals with IDD become involved in the criminal justice system as victims, witnesses, suspects, defendants, or incarcerated individuals, they face fear, prejudice, and lack of understanding. These people are unrecognized as having a disability, victimized at high rates, denied redress, denied due process, and discriminated against in sentencing, confinement, and release. Today, we will hear from experts in the field, Leanne Davis and Robin Holt, updating us on the best practices in the field of IDD and criminal justice and how these practices are changing lives. Melissa?
Thank you, Roxanne. And now I'd like to take a few moments to introduce our presenters today. Leanne Davis is a Senior Director of Disability and Justice Initiatives at the ARC of the United States. She directs the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. Ms. Davis oversaw the development of NCCJD's signature training, Pathways to Justice, and she works to establish NCCJD and the ARC's 650 chapter networks as the go-to place for information and training on justice and disability. Her mission is to ensure people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a platform and the training they need to advocate for themselves, especially as citizens who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Robin Holt is the Director of Criminal Justice Advocacy Program of the ARC of New Jersey. Prior to this position, she worked in the areas of crisis, partial care, community outreach, and directing the largest supported housing program in New York City. In her current position, Robin facilitates necessary connections, partnerships, and collaborations with professionals and community leaders to identify and execute best practices for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Robin has a master's degree in counseling psychology, as well as dual degrees in psychiatric rehabilitation and psychology. She's currently pursuing a master's in social work. And I would like to just take a couple of moments to see who all is joining us in this meeting. So thank you so much for participating in our poll. It looks like we have a good half of you joining us from urban locations, followed by about a quarter of you joining from rural locations, and then about 20% joining from more suburban locations. So thank you so much for joining us. And we do have a few of you joining from a reservation, Pueblo, or Alaska Native village. Welcome. And in terms of organizations where you all are joining us from, we're seeing a majority of you are joining from corrections, probation, and parole, followed by community-based provider organizations and government and policy. We're also seeing a few representatives from academia, the hospital systems, judiciary, and law enforcement. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to now turn it over to our presenters to begin our presentations. Leanne.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Roxanne, for that great introduction. As we get started today, what a great audience. I am so excited to be here, as I know Robin is as well, to just give you an overview of key issues around people with intellectual and developmental disabilities involved in the criminal justice system. We do have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. So I just wanted to introduce you, in case you don't know us, to the ARC and to our National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. The ARC is the largest organization in the United States that serves people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've been around for over 70 years. And so we are a rather old organization that really started with parents who wanted more for their children that had an intellectual or developmental disability, especially in the school system. And today, our mission is to promote and protect the human rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, while also supporting their full inclusion and participation in the community throughout their lives. So we work to ensure that people with disabilities are fully included. And you can imagine there can be some challenges around this when it comes to criminal justice issues. We work at the policy program level as well as provide legal advocacy at the national office. And right now we have over 600 chapters throughout the country, one of which is the ARC of New Jersey. And you'll be hearing from Robin about the amazing work they're doing around criminal justice issues after I speak today. So more about our National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. We are actually turning 10 years old this year. We were created in 2013 through a grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is within the Department of Justice. Although we had been doing quite a bit of work in this area for many years, it wasn't until we got this grant that really solidified that there needs to be a national center on this topic. And so we've been working ever since to really raise awareness of these issues throughout the country and empower our chapters to be able to do this work, along with other nonprofits that are really seeking to work with their local law enforcement, with the courts, with any criminal justice related entities that will encounter people with intellectual and developmental disability. Our mission at the center is to advocate at that intersection where there needs to be criminal justice reform, but also ensuring that the rights of people with disabilities are protected and promoted. Another unique thing that I like to point out about the center is that we work not just on one side of the issue or the other. We advocate for both crime victims and witnesses with disabilities, as well as those who are suspect and defendants. It's very important that we look at both sides of that because we know from data that people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system as both. We have a broad portfolio of projects and contracts from federal government and foundations. At this time, we have 7 projects and a couple of contracts we're working on with 3 full-time staff. Our target audiences include disability advocates, criminal justice professionals, people with IDD or intellectual developmental disability, as well as, I mentioned, our chapter network. This is another overview of kind of what we do at the center. We provide training and technical assistance, and a key part of that is our Pathways to Justice training, which I'll explain here in a minute. We provide nationwide information referral. So anyone listening in today, if you have an issue come up in your community, you feel free to call us so that we can help either with resources or connect you to folks that can help you in your area. We have calls from people with disabilities themselves to law enforcement, to court officials. So we get all kinds of questions come through that line. We also create and collect resources in our National Center and provide education through social media, webinars, and other outlets. So I wanted to just start with the groundwork or the key information that you need to know about this topic. And what we point to is the data that we have that we can really look to as a national sample. We don't have a lot of research in this field, so we really grab onto that which we can find and look to. And one of the things that we do have comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that found that 2 in 10 prisoners and 3 in 10 jail inmates reported having a cognitive disability. And this was the most commonly reported type of disability in that survey. So they looked at folks with different types of disabilities, but they found that those with specifically cognitive disability were the ones that were most likely to be in the system. You might also want to note that in looking at what kind of definition is used there, the definition of cognitive disability is people who have Down syndrome, autism, dementia, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and traumatic brain injury. So that is covering a lot of different types of disabilities, but at least it does give us that idea of what type of disability that people may be more at risk of getting involved in the system. And so there is quite a bit more research to do in there, but that is the numbers that we have now. Some of the barriers to justice include disability going unrecognized or completely dismissed as irrelevant. People can face higher rates of arrest, conviction, and receive longer sentences once they're in the system. And we still see inaccessible diversion and rehabilitation programs. So making sure that, again, justice is accessible to people with IDD specifically. And I do want to mention that I will probably use IDD as a shorthand for intellectual developmental disability throughout the rest of the presentation. So let's look at the flip side of this issue when it comes to research. We know that people with IDD are more likely to be victimized as well. So you'll see on the right side of the scale that individuals with, again, cognitive disabilities, using that same definition, face the highest rates of violent victimization, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It was about 5 years ago when the NPR did a series called the Abused and Betrayed series, where they worked with BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, to look specifically at sexual assault. And data taken from that same survey found that people with intellectual disability are 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault than those without disabilities. So these are high numbers, and this is why this population is so important when we think about barriers to justice, when we think about access. We really need to be keeping people with IDD in mind. And also, to Roxanne's point, people with dual diagnosis. So people who may have both an IDD and a mental health disability. And that is a key population that oftentimes people want to say, we don't do that. Do you do that? And then that person ends up not having any services. So that's another key area that we focus in on the center, is making sure that that people's needs are met regardless of where they are in that kind of that long line of different diagnoses. So what's always important to keep in mind is this, the issue of intersectionality, and that people are never just one identity. One of the things that we often say is, when we think about how to reach individuals who are in the criminal justice system with disabilities, we need to think about how are we reaching individuals who are least likely to get the support, who in other words may be the most invisible that we haven't thought about. And so this really goes to the issue of disability and race as well. And if we look at some of the research on this, it's pretty alarming. So we know that between 1/3 and 1/2 of people shot and killed by police in the U.S. have some type of a disability. And then an American Journal of Public Health article found that young people with disabilities were 13% more likely to be arrested than peers without a disability. Now, when we break that down further to Black youth, we see that that figure actually jumps to 17% for Black youth with disabilities. And then people with disabilities have an overall 43% chance of arrest, with much of that risk falling on young Black men. So in looking at all of these issues, understanding how this impacts particular communities is absolutely critical to understanding these issues overall, and thinking about what type of solutions we need and how are we having that sort of cultural humility when we're addressing different populations within the intellectual developmental disability community. Some of the common interactions that we often address in the training that we provide comes from the International Association of Chiefs of Police work that they've done in this area. They have a policy and procedures statements where they provide that to police departments throughout the country to give them an idea of how they address certain topics within their own police agencies. And one of those that we worked on, a concepts and issues paper with them, was related specifically to people with IDD. And these were some of the common interactions that were specified within that document. So we see that people with IDD can be recruited without understanding what's going on to participate in crime. They may much more easily give false confessions. Someone may call because a behavior they're doing looks suspicious or is offensive to someone. And so just a neighbor could even call on that, or any kind of strange or quote out of the ordinary behavior. Someone with autism, specifically children with autism, may be wondering. And we see that this has been an issue where often people with autism, children with autism, when they do wander off, they're actually drawn to bodies of water. And we've seen how often they can die due to drowning in those situations. So there is programs right now and grant money to address that situation to try to help raise awareness about that. And then just different physical issues like people having seizures. We know that people with intellectual developmental disabilities are more likely to have accompanying physical disabilities. So you might see that as well. So in terms of something that we are doing at the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability within the ARC is creating training and ways that communities can bring this information to their local law enforcement, courts, and victim service providers. And what we've created is what's called the Pathways to Justice program. And basically there's 3 steps involved in that. And step 1 is to start with creating a disability response team. And what this team does is they do not respond in the moment, but they're more of a planning and proactive group that thinks through how do we ensure that we're ready to respond when something happens, and how are we thinking strategically about how we're addressing this community in what we do. Are we leaving people out? Are we seeing where the challenges are for people with IDD or dual diagnosis where they have both mental health and IDD? So that team gets started, and then through that, the next step is to actually come and provide the training working with the team. So we would co-train with the law enforcement officer, with the victim service provider, and with an attorney to do 3 different modules during that day, specific to each of those professional groups. And then lastly, at the end of the day, we actually have folks think about putting together an action plan and what they want to see as next steps, both for themselves professionally, how they would respond to someone with an IDD, but also within their systems, within the groups that they work with. How do they want to see different things happen so that there can be better communication and you'll know what to do when you encounter someone with this type of a disability? And some key principles that this training is built on includes that idea of nothing about us without us. And for those here in the disability community, you already know what I'm talking about, but this is a key kind of mantra that is often used to help society understand that nothing should be created unless people that are living with disabilities are involved. So do not create anything without us at the table. And in fact, part of this training definitely includes people with IDD. We want to bring co-trainers in who also have an intellectual developmental disability, and that they are key in this training and providing training to law enforcement and others. And then this is also very community-based. Communities know their community best and what they need. So it's about connecting the dots between the mental health system, the IDD system, the law enforcement, the courts, are these dots being connected throughout the community? And if not, how can we make that happen? So it's really having those kind of deeper in the weeds conversations. And all this happens before training day with the DRT, as well as during the training itself. And then really the training is just the first step. And after that, it's about implementing that continually in the community. Again, bringing that multidisciplinary piece is so important. We found that when we go provide this training, people have said we've never spoken, we never had a chance to speak to these different individuals at the same time on this issue. So having that opportunity is really important. And then building relationships with people with disabilities who are in the room, being able to have that opportunity in a non-crisis environment and situation is really important. This is just an overview of what a disability response team is and does. And Robin can also speak to some of the work that they've done Pathways to Justice there, and how they're continuing to do work through their own disability response team. This is an example of a handout that we would provide through the training. We have tip sheets that are provided at different points. And this one is on the 10 facts that law enforcement need to know. And I just wanted to provide this as an example of how we try to bring kind of key knowledge in each module and for each professional group into a fact sheet that can then be used and looked at after the training day. One of the really important tools that we use in the training is providing this Pathways to Justice model. And essentially what this is, many of you are familiar with the sequential intercept map, perhaps the SIM map, which is used for the mental health community. And so we took that same concept of the SIM map and overlaid that with concerns around people with IDD specifically. So what you're seeing now is just the general outline of what we use to think through someone going through the system. There's a second piece to this that really outlines more specific barriers to justice and what is it that what are key services people need throughout the model. And this can be very specific to a community and to certain systems. So this is a great tool that we like to use with communities as we're thinking through next steps for how they want to address specific challenges. We have 15 disability response teams in 12 different states, and you can see that on your slide here where we've gone to provide the training. We've trained over 1,200 professionals since 2015, and we did hit a speed bump during COVID because all of this training has been in person. It's been very important to get people in the room together, especially because we're bringing people with disabilities into the training, and we really want that opportunity for people to meet each other and talk to each other in person. But this year we're actually looking at revising the training to bring in new information and update what we currently have, and also have more of a focus on intersectionality and bringing more of new data around that into the training as well. And so we're very excited about that and looking at relaunching at the end of the year. I wanted to mention one more resource before I turn it over to Robin. So we've been working with the University of Cincinnati, as well as Policy Research Associates, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the National Policing Institute on what's called the Academic Training to Inform Police Response. And we are now in the final stretch of that project. And we've been able to create this new online training for law enforcement. And I do stress that this is a curriculum only. It's not a program, but a curriculum. And it's a 40-hour curriculum that is completely free. We've got the information here, and I know it will be posted in the chat as well. But the key kind of information that officers are getting here is knowing how to respond to people with both mental health disabilities and intellectual developmental disability. And this was just an incredible opportunity to bring more information about IDD into training that maybe law enforcement are used to getting at a certain level. But this is bringing much more about IDD into the curriculum. And so I just wanted to share that as a brand new resource that just recently came out so that you can check that out. And if you are not a police agency yourself, maybe you can share this with your police agency. And with that, there's some references of what I spoke about today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and hopefully we'll get time to talk about that today. But I'm so excited now to hand it over to Robin, who is really more on the state level of this issue and is going to talk to you about their amazing program in New Jersey.
Thank you so much, Leanne. I appreciate the kind words. I'm trying to move this slide. Here we go. Sorry about that. So yes, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this very important matter pertaining to individuals with IDD and the criminal justice system. So a lot to get into, so we'll start. As you can see on this particular slide, our program really functions in a very multifaceted and comprehensive way to ensure that the needs of our clients are met as best as possible. With that said, we do acknowledge and we recognize that doing client-oriented work alone will not necessarily accomplish our goals that we have as a program to reach sort of more of the systemic levels of change that we'd like to see. However, reverting back to the slide, there are 4 primary components of our program, again, called the Criminal Justice Advocacy Program. They include providing alternatives to incarceration for individuals with IDD. Again, our program right now, we work with adults who are 21 and older who have indictable offenses, including violent and threat crimes, manslaughter, aggravated assault, arson, terroristic threats. We also work a lot within sex-related cases. This could include sexual assault, lewdness, a lot of cyber sex offenses, and we also dabble in theft, property, and weapons charges as well. So this task is usually conducted through what we call personalized justice plans, and I will get into that more in depth later in the presentation. We also provide support and advocacy on behalf of our clients and their unique needs as they move throughout the different sections of the criminal justice system. This advocacy takes various forms, and it depends on the context and on the individual's needs. One of the most prevalent ways that we advocate is during or beforehand to prepare and help the client for court appearances. Again, that includes a lot of different things, introduction letters, correspondence with attorneys, judges, law clerks, so on and so forth. So CJAP, I should preface this, the acronym CJAP is short for Criminal Justice Advocacy Program, so I'll be using that as we proceed. So CJAP also facilitates a whole bunch of different trainings across the state of New Jersey. Just some examples to put out there include crisis intervention trainings, which really focus towards law enforcement and community professionals primarily. We also do trainings for court personnel. We also have a monthly webinar series, which is called Equal Justice Talks. And we do trainings for schools, jails, prisons, as well as for families. And the last bit here, our program functions as what we call, quote, a clearinghouse of information, not just for clients or individuals who themselves have a diagnosis of IDD, but also for families, as well as for human service and education system as well. So we do encourage anybody who has a question or an inquiry pertaining to really anything having to do with the criminal justice system and IDD to contact us. Even if we ourselves don't necessarily have the answer, we will surely try to find the best way to direct you. Okay. So the question is, why are we talking about this, and what truly is the scope of the issue? The primary concern is that individuals with IDD are immensely overrepresented throughout the criminal justice system. And that's not only in our state, which I mentioned is New Jersey, but it's really across the nation, like I know Leanne touched upon. So as noted, it's estimated that individuals with IDD account for about 10% of those who are incarcerated. So when you're comparing those statistics to IDD in the general population, we're talking about a massive difference at only 2 to 3% in the general population. So when you think about that, what does this tell us? Well, in my mind, something is very clearly amiss when we're talking about this particular population. So there's a lot of different reasons for this vast overrepresentation that we see. And to thoroughly understand this issue, we have to keep in mind that the criminal justice system is sort of like a funnel in many ways. So the initial arrest by law enforcement is really the first step of many to come. So after the arrest, that individual faces a whole slew of barriers and obstacles as they move throughout the court system before sometimes, unfortunately, ending up in jail or prison. So another question is, what actually contributes to the increased rates of the incarceration? So there are many times in which a cognitive disability, in other words, a lower IQ, leads to legal issues. Just for example purposes, an individual with an intellectual disability may not recognize or realize that picking up a food item and taking it without paying is necessarily illegal or wrong. Another example is a person's expression of affection toward another person. So an individual with an ID may not recognize that those acts can be considered as harassment or even sexual assault. On the other hand, ID is not always a contributor to the propensity of criminality. Many individuals with IDD become more susceptible to involvement with the legal system because of external factors, such as the environment that they grew up in, their personal life experiences, or sometimes even the lack thereof, adequate education, and that chance to have some of those experimental experiences that organically happen. Again, for example purposes, let's use a person with IDD who grew up, let's say, within the confines of a group home. So many times, as wonderful as the staff in the group home may be, the topic of, let's say, sex education or appropriateness when we're speaking about boundaries may not be a topic that's always thought of necessarily to teach or even to discuss with the members of the group home. So that particular individual who's growing up and living in that environment, they may also have limited exposure and experience to explore sexuality. And like I said before, to sort of organically learn about what is societally accepted versus what isn't. So once that person, who again, sort of maybe had more of like a sheltered environment, let's say they turn 18 and they become an adult and they leave the group home. They enter the world without necessarily having those experiences or education that many of us without an IDD gain throughout our, livelihood and adolescence. So without that knowledge of what is appropriate, that person, let's say, sees a good-looking guy or a good-looking girl on the street and goes up to them because they find them attractive, gives them a hug or a kiss to show affection, and this one act can actually propel that person directly into the criminal justice system and even possibly land them in jail. Again, all from that one act that that person did, not understanding or seeing it as wrong or harmful. So we see these type of situations a lot. You know, I have, unfortunately, a lot of referrals that we get. And when we talk about the explanation with the family member, with the client, we see a lot of things that happen, such as this. So again, this is just one example of many differing circumstances, but just to shed some light and some insight into how one seemingly non-malicious act can turn into a life-altering experience for that person. So just a little bit of history regarding CJAP and how it started. The Citizen Advocacy Program, which began around 1972, started because there was a realization from the members of the ARC of New Jersey, and the ARC, I should say, that community collaboration would precipitate further change for those with IDD who need more sort of one-on-one training and just more assistance in the community. So this expanded as the community's needs became more obvious and evident, noticing that individuals with IDD often became entangled within the criminal justice system. Many times inadvertently, the program began training geared toward law enforcement because of that reason. So later, that work became known as the Criminal Justice Education Project, which ultimately was a precursor to the Developmentally Disabled Offenders Program. So the goal of this program, which is very similar to present day with CJAP, was to facilitate an understanding amongst personnel across all sectors of criminal justice about the specific needs, the specific interests and characteristics of individuals with IDD. So this outreach included probation, parole, correctional officers, judges, public defenders, prosecutors, really anybody associated with the criminal justice system. So that program's efficacy and their unique focus continued to get attention from the IDD community and even beyond. So in the early 2000s, DDOP changed its name to what we know now as the Criminal Justice Advocacy Program. So as you could see here, this is just some information regarding our census, at least at that current point that I made the slide, because this census number does vary from month to month, but on average, it usually remains above 100 at any given time. So as noted here in 2022, 52 cases were closed due to positive outcomes as listed. Through our advocacy and training to those that we come encounter with, we proceed throughout the process and are able to garner understanding of the individual's diagnosis, as well as the correlated effect that that person's diagnosis may have on their behavior. So this is something that we try to convey as we're moving along and interacting with different parties of the criminal justice system. So for example, a prominent diagnosis that we find especially helpful and is necessary to educate on is fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, also known as FASD. So one of the more common adverse outcomes associated with FASD is unfortunately criminal justice system involvement. And individuals with FASD are also believed to be overrepresented, again, in forensic and correctional settings. In fact, FASD affects an estimated 2 to about 5% of the population in the US and in Canada. So our program has recognized a very persistent trend in which individuals with FASD are charged with shoplifting, burglary, or some type of similar offense. Again, many are unaware of the prominent symptoms of FASD, which the key one is impulsivity, along with some other impairments, including language comprehension, memory retention, reasoning, so on and so forth. So there's an abundance of research pertaining to this particular topic, again, both in the US and in Canada. In a case such as this, our community resource coordinators, which I might use CRC depending on how we go here, but that's the acronym. Community resource coordinators are the staff that works for the program. They would first make sure that they identify the diagnosis once they see, let's say, an FASD diagnosis. At that point, they would speak with the individual's attorney. Again, really reach out to all of those criminal justice parties that are involved. So again, this is an opportunity for the awareness and the education piece to start. I do just want to preface this and make a statement that we don't provide legal assistance or advisement, and we don't speak on an individual's plea. So, a lot of times we'll get questions like, do you think the person actually did it? Or, what's your opinion? We don't speak on anything pertaining to the actual legal. We speak from an advocacy and education place. So I know for a fact that, between me and my staff, a lot of court personnel has expressed gratitude, for the information that they got and the education, and have often said, if we didn't hear about this, we would have never known, this person might need accommodations, so on and so forth. So these are just some more statistics regarding our program's efficacy on a larger scale. And I just want to quickly touch upon the piece about co-occurring diagnoses and IDD, as Leanne had mentioned. So in relation to our census at any given time, about 50% or more have comorbidities of mental illness, most predominantly, but also physical, neurological, and learning disabilities as well. So it's sort of very seldom that we work on a case in which a person has just a diagnosis of IDD by itself. And I think that this speaks to a huge concern regarding overall treatment and service provisions. And again, I know Leanne sort of touched upon this issue, and I'll speak from my personal observations and my experiences, but it appears that the harsh realities of sort of antiquated and sometimes fractured systems are particularly problematic for individuals with IDD who have co-occurring disabilities. As mentioned, we're noticing that one sector will say, we don't do that. We work with just IDD. And then you go to the other sector and they say, no, we only work with individuals with severe and persistent mental illness, leaving that person who has co-occurring disorders to sort of just question where they're going to get their treatment from. And sometimes it just never happens, which is a huge, huge problem. These particular cases that involve co-occurring, sometimes with 1, 2, 3 different diagnoses, really require more holistic and integrated approaches. It seems as though, and I know more and more are coming around, but very traditional practices based on the medical model are still being actively used. And obviously this becomes extremely challenging as practitioners often do not communicate or propose unified interventions for that person because, again, they tend to be very segregated. So the already intricate nature of diagnoses is magnified with the additional layer of the criminal justice involvement. So comorbidities and then adding something like criminal justice issues on top. So state systems tend to view these classifications of diagnoses, like I mentioned before, with separate entities. So one designated IDD, the other for mental illness, the other for physical disability, so on and so forth. So with the high prevalence of comorbidities, the separation causes huge barriers to effective treatment. Once an individual with IDD is indicated or in the process of navigating the criminal justice system, most direct service and community professionals are not always trained in addressing these matters, and ultimately leads to a less favorable outcome for the client. So upon starting this job, I guess it's about 1.5 years ago, I noticed major issues regarding data collection in relation to racial, ethnic, and marginalized communities. So my team and I have begun making sort of the biggest changes that we can, that is feasible, in the way of revised intake forms, a new case management system, as well as more specified data collection practices to better gauge our training and our advocacy and service needs. So I do just want to, I want to provide a bit more of an in-depth description of our personalized justice plans. So CJAP creates these plans, which I'll refer to as PJPs for short. These are documents that are used to educate and inform courts and associated parties about individuals' services and support needs. This document is presented ultimately to the court system as an alternative to incarceration and can be used throughout the progression of that person's involvement with the system. So during this process, our goal is to ensure that the legal parties who are involved understand the risks and the vulnerabilities that individuals with IDD are at when they are incarcerated. So I think Leanne touched upon this, but individuals with IDD tend to have much higher recidivism rates and lower rates of successful reintegration into communities upon their release. So this lack of access not only negatively impacts the person's quality of life and their personal outcomes, but it's also a legal violation of the ADA. Accommodations must be, wait, I think I got a little confused here. Yes. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Hold on a sec. Okay. So I know I went over a lot of this already, but I want to highlight the piece regarding the monitoring status that you'll see listed here. So as shown, once an individual is placed on either probation or parole, we will continue to monitor that personalized justice plan until their sentence is completed. So there is no set monitoring schedule, and it really depends on the circumstances as well as the person. So I just want to expand a bit more about the process of drafting a personalized justice plan. And I do want to mention that not every client that's served by by CJAP will require one of these documents. This document is traditionally only drafted when an individual is facing a jail or a prison sentence or is already incarcerated. So our hope is that we don't need to get to the point where drafting a personalized justice plan is necessary. If our team is able to work with the courts and the officials to advocate for either dismissal, a dropped or reduced charge, that PJP is not needed, essentially. So the process of drafting these plans are definitely collaborative in nature, and they do require the participation of the client. So as you see here on the slide, the personalized justice plan addresses several areas of one's life domain. Again, in working with the person, working with their support system, we focus on the areas that will most affect the person's well-being and their welfare in a positive way. So we look at each domain and discuss which interventions, which services or modifications would best help the person remain successful in the community while also working to prevent any other legal issues in the future. For example, in the vocational domain, if the person would like to work or would like to begin the process of working toward employment, we would think about the best ways to go about this, perhaps including a referral for the person to Project Hire, which is one of the programs within the ARC of New Jersey, or to DVRS. This would go under that particular domain of vocation, and that would go for housing, for treatment, so on and so forth. So once that plan is finalized, it's then condensed into a letter where the case's details are more thoroughly explained. The letter is then given to the person's attorney prior to their court appearance, as well as to the judge if applicable. So once the individual and the community resource coordinator appear in court, they could then take that opportunity to sort of expand upon that personalized justice plan and what's included in that. So without reading the slide, I'll just focus on the key piece here. Our program will typically hold a case open until there is some sort of resolution, whether that's completion of parole, completion of probation, if the person was ordered to a treatment program, like a drug and alcohol treatment program, we would keep that case open and would consider that case to be in monitoring status until the person completes, whatever it is, whatever the program demands of them. So as you can see here, the goals of a personalized justice plan is multi-pronged. It has many different pieces to it. And these here listed are the primary 4. So to give more insight into what a personalized justice plan example would look like, I do want to go through some real examples that have been used by our program in some of the cases. So here, I know that's a lot of writing. This includes examples pertaining to the residential domain. So the intervention can be as minimal as an increase in, let's say, already existing supports, as you see in the first case here. Or it could be a bit more in depth, as in the second example, where the community resource coordinator helped to refer the client to a center that would provide basic needs, but could also further assist that person in setting up some more services that they may need. So here in this example, the client decided that he wanted to enroll in a program based out of this specific school. And I should just note that the specifics of these examples have been altered. The community resource coordinators help the client and their community support providers to identify a place that makes sense and coincides with what the individual is looking for. So if the client is not ready to immediately begin their sort of educational journey, we could also refer the client to educational planning services as well. So many times a contingency within those personalized justice plans includes some type of programming. And usually it's in the form of a day program. So just for defining purposes, a day program is an establishment that is for those in need of some type of daily activities to develop various skills, whether they're vocation, psychosocial, so on and so forth, self-help. In this case, it was agreed that this individual would attend a day program 5 days per week, again, in contingency to the personalized justice plan. So the vocational domain is one of the more prominent when we draft our PJPs. In example 1, this individual was referred to DVRS to begin the employment process. And in the second example, the client is already working, but with the assistance of his job coach, will then start the next step, which is actively applying to jobs. The advocacy domain can take shape in many different ways. So in this particular example, the community resource coordinator is tasked with further assistance in helping the client through his probationary period, as well as to help with any future linkages, whether that is to DDD or employment, so on and so forth. So the treatment domain, again, differs depending on each person's needs. So here you will see various examples of service provision ranging from in-home supports to referral to agencies and organizations for mental health services, as well as to substance use treatment that is included on the next slide. So here is the example of a case in which one of the community resource coordinators made a referral to a medication-assisted treatment facility for the client for their substance use needs. So I should note that mental health probation that you see here does not occur for all individuals. Community resource coordinators may advocate for this specialized need, but there is a process that needs to be completed to assess whether a person meets the criteria for this. Despite that, this domain would look similar if there was sort of more of a standard probationary setup instead of this. This domain, as you can see, is reserved for someone's medical needs, again, in an effort to effectuate the continuity of care in all respects, of course, which would include the medical needs. The transition to community domain can be very complex, as this is a very vulnerable process for our clients. So our CRCs, community resource coordinators, work hand in hand and collaboratively with other professionals to ensure that there's a feasible and a comprehensive plan that is in place when it is time for the client to return to the community. Penalties and pay. So community resource coordinators work alongside the client to ensure that either a payment plan or some type of agreement is in place for the client to be able to successfully pay off any fines that were accrued during or throughout the court appearance process. So here is a diagram that was created by one of our community resource coordinators, Pat. This picture, I feel, does a really good job in signifying the complexity of IDD when we're talking in terms of the court system, as we see it as a program at least. And again, for anyone interested, I could definitely send a copy because there's a description for each of the keys, so just let me know. And there's no slide for this, but as a team, we continue to make strides towards equity and equality for individuals with IDD in the criminal justice system. Again, as I mentioned earlier, on a systemic level. Recently, this includes the acceptance of our language that we suggested to the Division of Developmental Disabilities to their support program policies and procedures manual. We advocated for a piece to be in this manual relating to individuals with IDD and criminal justice matters, so that all support coordinators across the state know that we are a resource and that we should be the primary resource when we're talking about IDD and criminal justice matters. And this was actually accepted and was revised as of last month, actually. We're also involved in various federal and state grants pertaining to topics such as sexual violence. And we're also doing or contributing training for correctional personnel as well. And I think that's all I have for you. So thank you all so much again for your time.
All right, thank you so much, Robin and Leanne, for your presentations. If you have questions, please go ahead and head to the Q&A icon there at the bottom of your screen and submit questions. We already have several questions submitted, so we'll go ahead and dive into those. And Leanne and Robin, I will try to direct the question to the right person. However, there might be a couple where you both might want to respond. So I welcome you both to respond to questions, even if it wasn't directed to you. So we have just come off of Robin's presentation. And so we do have a few questions related to her work. So I'll start with one there. So someone anonymously asked, it would be great to have a personalized justice plan type of a plan for individuals with IDD and individuals with dual diagnosis that are released from incarceration. Often the incarcerated system, jails and prisons, do not adequately know how or do not have the resources to provide an appropriate reentry plan. Are there examples or toolkits for criminal justice professionals on the incarcerated side so they can appropriately assist individuals with reentry? And so, Robin, I'll just start with you in terms of your thoughts in response to the question about reentry support. And then, Leanne, certainly welcome you to chime in if you have any additional information or resources.
Yeah, so that is a great point and a great question as well. I don't know if there's a specific toolkit. I do know that this is a very vast issue. On our end, what we've been trying to do is link up with various community agencies that focus specifically on reentry, and we've been sort of trying to partner to see how we could improve that process. But as of now, I don't have a specific toolbox per se when we're talking about reentry issues.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, there isn't a lot on that yet. And the most that we've been able to work on is with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. We've been doing some work with them in creating some publications to help folks know what are the resources. And I think one of the key issues there is thinking about accommodations when we're looking at reentry. We're currently working on a project this is interesting, that's looking at the healthcare needs of youth with disabilities who are transitioning out of the juvenile justice system. And we're seeking to get stories from youth themselves about their experiences and what they need. So there's like little pockets of things going on, but we're not really seeing like whole publications or briefs just on that one issue in particular, but I'm happy to share with you, Melissa, to share out some of the CSG resources we've been working on.
Thank you, Leanne. Okay, so there was a lot of interest in some of the chapters under ARC, and lots of interest around from folks who don't believe they have a chapter in their state. So Jasmine said, I live in Pennsylvania, which is one of the states that was not highlighted on the map. Would we be able to reach out to a surrounding state representative for support or somewhere locally that's similar to your program? So Leanne, what would you advise?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I did want to, and I did put some of this I cheated a little and started answering things in the chat early because I didn't know if we'd run out of time.
Right.
But I did put a link to where to find your chapter if you're interested in talking to a local or state chapter about what they're doing in criminal justice advocacy. So you can always go there. I also offered, if you want to contact me directly, I can see if there's a contact in that chapter as well, because I've been working at the ARC for 27 years doing this work. So I've tried to know who's doing what, although it's hard because there's so many different things going on, but I'm just helping to make those connections as well. And it may not be a chapter of the ARC. Say there's a affiliate of an FASD advocacy nonprofit or an autism society. There may be other folks that are doing this work that aren't specifically the ARC chapter. So that's another possibility that you could reach out to individuals like that. There's, I've been working with a group for 2 years out in San Jose, California, that have been real interested in bringing this pathways training. So just recently, we got to a point where everyone's on board now, there's funding, and we're bringing that pathways training to their community, but that wasn't through a chapter. So it may be a chapter or it may not. It depends on who has the capacity and the connections and really the interest in bringing this to their community.
Thank you, Leanne. So I did get a question from someone in the jail settings. And so Robin, again, I'll start with you with this, but Leanne, certainly welcome you to chime in as well. Samantha said that, as far as a jail setting, are there questions we should have in our medical questionnaire to ask of individuals? Right now, we just ask, do you have any medical issues? But I feel there may be a better way to ask specifically about IDD. So Robin, what would you suggest? And then Leanne also would be interested in your response.
Yes, there most definitely should be a more thorough discussion in terms of those screening assessments and evaluations. And this is something we speak to a lot of people about. It tends to be very basic, as you mentioned. And unfortunately, this is how this issue perpetuates, is that once a person gets into jail or prison, these assessments are not catching or really capturing whether somebody has an IDD because of the simplicity of them. It unfortunately takes a person to get like halfway or fully through the criminal justice system before someone says, oh, you know, this person is acting or saying or you know, something behaviorally is a little bit off, and then that's when the person maybe gets a more thorough assessment. There should absolutely be something in the assessment to help better gauge whether a person has IDD or even a mental illness. I mean, just in general, these assessments need to be improved, you know, in this realm altogether. In terms of specific ideas, I do have things that my team and I have worked on. So I could definitely email them to you or communicate with you offline if you want to learn more about just our perspective in terms of some of the questions that should or would be helpful in terms of the assessments.
Okay, so we have a specific person who asked for that question, but we'll also try to share some of that information more broadly. Leanne, do you have any suggestions?
This is a big problem. We don't have, just like Robin was saying, we don't have enough of those questions, especially in the national data sets. So one of the things we tried to do at one point is work with the state and jail prison, is it the SILJ? One of the, federal studies, surveys that go out in our self-report from prisoners and jail inmates, right, through BJS. And we were reviewing what questions are being asked. And there was, I don't know, 7 pages of questions related to mental health, mental illness. And then there was one question at the very end of that that said, have you ever been in special ed? And that was the entirety of capturing data about people with IDD. So that blew my mind. And I realized that's why we don't have data. If we're not even asking it at that level, then how much is this really going on in different communities where state or local jails or prisons, that they are asking those questions. And that is something that we delved into, again, with the contract with the Council of State Governments, is looking at what different ways are we providing these kinds of screenings and what's included in that. So that's another publication. It didn't go as far as I would have liked to because it's hard to find that information, but we did mention that in different types of screenings that are being used. And the fact that in our research prior to this, what we did find that was actually validated was mostly not in this country. So it's really hard to find that. But that's something else, Melissa. I'll look for that publication and put it in the chat. Great question.
Okay. So, yeah, we'll try to find more information about specific questions or specific screening tools that folks can use. There were also a number of questions about competency and how there is that, some overlap of competency, people in the civil competency system with IDD, and that's a little bit outside the scope of our webinar today, but I did want to just offer Robin and Leanne an opportunity to maybe respond to some of those concerns, as there are several people on the call that are working in the competency spaces. So, Leanne, if we could start with you, any thoughts or suggestions in terms of, how people can better support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are going through the competency process?
Yeah, this is a very complex topic, and one that back in I think it was 2015, when we did a webinar on this topic and created a publication because we were getting several questions around competency to stand trial. I am not an attorney by trade. And as an advocate who even knows a lot about these issues, I was kind of overwhelmed in thinking about how do you really advocate in that area. So what we did is created that publication, and I did put it in the chat for folks to take a look at to see if maybe that can help answer some of the questions that you might have around the topic. But as far as having clients that are facing those issues, I was wondering maybe if Robin, if you have, had that situation happen, given you're right there at the level of interacting with the clients one-on-one.
Yeah, this concept, like Leanne indicated, it's in my mind very murky. We have had a lot of our clients go through the competency process, and I will say, just as an outsider, it is extremely frustrating because it indicates what we know, that people have such immense lack of education and knowledge surrounding what an intellectual and developmental disability is and what that means in terms of a person's lifelong trajectory. So when the prospect of competency does come up for our clients, we do our best to, again, educate them that this is not something that's going to be changing in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. However, because of the process that they have, that again is extremely antiquated and doesn't speak to all different populations, they have a system in which, let's say somebody who has severe autism enters the court system, they we'll go through the competency evaluation, but there's a procedure in place that this person will have to sit in jail until they're reassessed every 6 months. So that reassessment can happen up to, I don't know exactly the statute, but we've had clients who have been reassessed for competency at least 10 times. Again, while the person is in jail. And, the attorneys, the judges will even say to us, I hear what you're saying, that this is not something that's going to change drastically, but this is our process of establishing competency. So they'll do the testing, they'll do the same evaluations from 6 months, again, 6 months later, again, 6 months later, until it gets to a point where someone somewhere, some physician, some doctor will say, hey, I don't think that there's going to be a restoration of competency. Let's move forward in this direction. And that's why I started this conversation by saying, from our perspective, it could be an extremely frustrating process for both ourselves to witness, but obviously more so for the client and their families that have to endure this process. Again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm pretty sure there's a lot more to it than what I'm conveying, but again, this is coming from my perspective.
Well, and I just want to mention, Robin, just what you said is why we wanted to do this white paper. Throughout my career, I've been hearing from chapters of the ARC saying we've got someone still in the system because they're not competent. And it's equivalent to having a jail sentence, right? They still can't get out because of this competency issue. And you don't really see a lot of focused advocacy. And I think it is because of the complexity of it. And so the goal that we were thinking of trying to do is create at least like a tool for advocates to understand that, so that they can get in there and advocate, at least have a tool to begin to understand this, right? And I will say that even for attorneys, if they're not in this area, they don't understand either. So it is still an issue. And I don't know that we have research on that to know just how often that's happening, but it is happening.
Well, thank you both for your comments on that. And for those of you who weren't watching, Leanne did drop that a link to that brief in the chat again. I think we could do a whole webinar on this topic. So, I just didn't want to get through the Q&A without addressing it, without giving some time to such an important issue. So there are also just maybe one more question before we move into our closing slides. So we had someone ask, how do you assist with controlled settings accessing ADA supported accommodations, like interpreters, tutors for mandatory classes, or just advocacy to assist with their confirmed IDD or mental illness diagnosis? So any suggestions on that? It looks like this person is looking for more guidance on how they can ensure that a person's controlled settings, such as perhaps a jail or a prison or a courtroom, ensuring those allow access to needed ADA accommodations. So I'll start with Robin and then pass it off to Leanne.
Sure. This can be sort of, there's not a straightforward answer, because although there should be, we have went down various avenues and contacted many people, and there doesn't seem to be one person, again, there should be, but in charge of accommodations. Our luck that we've had most with is inmate advocates who are, again, I don't know if this differs from state to state, but at least in the prisons and jails that we work with, there tend to be, or there is a position called an inmate advocate. And I have really had great success once I was able to find that person and reach out to them. And then that person sort of makes it happen. So the inmate advocate then reaches out to whoever else needs to be included to make sure that the person is getting what they need. When we're talking more about courts, obviously, we usually go through the ADA coordinators who have been really helpful as well. And when all else fails, I try to reach out to the social work department or the mental health unit at the jail or prison and try to get in touch with somebody in that realm and say, look, this person is here, he needs A, B, C, can we make that happen? And getting someone on the phone first and foremost is always the most difficult part, but I have, in my experience, once you get that person on the phone, they're usually willing to help, but I wish there was more of a direct line. And maybe I am missing it, maybe my team is, but I'll go with inmate advocates at the jails and prisons to be most helpful.
Robin, I don't think you're missing it. Unfortunately, I think it can be hard to find that. And just from the national perspective, I did drop in the chat examples or guidance from the Department of Justice around what kind of example accommodations that law enforcement can do, accommodations in the courtroom. Where we've seen a lot of that missing is that over the years, ever since the ADA passed in 1990, a lot of the focus has been on physical disability. And so there hasn't been a lot of guidance around IDD. And it wasn't until what I dropped in the chat that we really started seeing more specific guidance around that. So we provided that. And as Robin mentioned, there are ADA coordinators. And especially with the past year or so, we've been doing a lot of training with them. So going to their trainings to help them understand about people with IDD. Remember, it's, they handle all type of disability. And a lot of times when you have that big umbrella of disability, that piece of IDD can easily get missed. So it's a lot of it is that education, but you can always go to your ADA coordinator. I remember sometimes that person has a little like 10% of their time to that. So it just depends on, what capacity they have, but they are someone that you can educate and start with, in terms of the accommodations. We actually have a chapter listening in right now that has been doing quite a bit around the ADA. And I don't know if, I wish we had more time, Misha and John Gottschall with the ARC of Benton County that have been doing some amazing work in their county and really looking into how the ADA impacts all of this and how we need to be really looking at that law to really push folks to understand this is not just a nice thing to do, this is the law. And that's why we passed it, why we have that law, to ensure that there is that equal access to justice. So we could probably get into a lot more just around the ADA as well, but I guess I will leave it at that.
Well, I think that's a great note to close on, is really reinforcing the importance of understanding that legislation and how to leverage it to maximize people's access to resources and supports. Such a critical thing that we could also do another whole webinar on. So I just want to say thank you so much to Leanne and Robin for their incredibly informative and helpful presentations today. And I really apologize we weren't able to get through all of the questions, but really appreciate the questions that everyone submitted, and we will be looking through those questions even following the webinar. So hang on, Ashley Dover just popped into the chat the certificate of attendance that you can see on the screen. And so you will want to click on that, and then you will be guided to download that directly to your computer. So Ashley has just put that in the chat. You should see it there at the bottom. And we also have some more information to share with you before we close out our webinar. Okay, so we have also throughout the webinar dropped a few resources, particularly from Leanne's presentation. So if you hadn't had a chance to download the Pathways for Justice model handout, Ashley just dropped it in the chat. And we will also drop the 10 facts law enforcement needs to know. That will also go in the chat momentarily. We also would want to invite you to join us in our next upcoming webinar on February 28th. And that webinar will be on accessing housing resources for supporting justice-involved individuals in reentry. And Ashley Sabatino just dropped a link in the chat to register for that webinar. If you are interested, we hope to see you then. And then finally, if you haven't joined our listserv yet, this is a great resource to keep in touch with the Gain Center, to learn more about upcoming webinars and receive additional information and resources that we produce. So you can either use your camera to pull up the QR code that's on the slide and sign in to get our newsletter there, or you can use the condensed URL, just enter that URL into your favorite browser. And Ashley also dropped that link into the chat, but it's quickly floating to the top. Ashley Dover just dropped the webinar attendance form back in the chat for those of you who missed it. And thank you so much to everyone for your applause and for your comments for our presenters. Yes, just once again, just want to say thank you so much, Robin and Leanne, for your presentation and the information you shared today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa.
And if you want to reach out to the Gain Center, if there were questions that you really wanted to have answered, feel free to reach out to SAMHSA's Gain Center. The link to the Gain Center is at the bottom of the slide, along with a direct phone number to reach us. So feel free to reach out to us if there's anything from this webinar that is still burning on your mind and you really would like to get additional support. Please do reach out to us. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. We'll leave this window open just a little bit longer for those of you who didn't get a chance to download that webinar attendance form. We'll drop it into the chat one more time. Ashley just dropped it in. So you will want to look for a chat from Ashley Sabatino, and you will click on it and save it directly to your computer. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a great afternoon.